shippers.
Mr. Siklik, I'm going to have to ask you to
That's over.
because we're past time. So, if
Sorry?
you can, I'll give you a just a concluding statement.
Concluding statement? Okay. Our priority is to ensure the ultimate passage of Bill C-49 in order to help correct the imbalance between the market power of the railway shippers, and we would strongly advocate for the deficiencies in the long-haul interest-switching to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Siklik. Now, Mr. Fransoo, for 7 minutes.
Thanks for that story, Warren. I think I've heard that from farmer after farmer after farmer that we can't get our grain to the ports and we can't get paid. So that's kind of the big thing. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, on behalf of the Western Canadian wheat growers, thank you for holding this meeting. I'm glad that this issue is getting some attention and the attention it needs, although I am saddened that we have to be holding it at all. As a grain farmer, I can state without hesitation that when our rail lines are only hauling 50% at most, a lot of people and a lot of farmers are hurting. Unfortunately, one of the reasons that these statistics have risen in the last couple of weeks is because carriers are running more trains on main lines, and many farmers and terminals on the sidelines or on side branch lines are still woefully short of rail stock. In addition, we are now facing spring breakup in many parts of the country. Road restrictions are coming into place. Then we have planting season. We can ill afford to have these kind of rail backlogs in the future. Like I stated, I personally know of many grain farmers who are having the same problems as Warren. One in particular has a barley contract that's three or four months behind that's worth $750,000. He's a good-sized farmer, but that's a lot of money to be waiting on. When grain is sitting in the farmer's bin, of course, we aren't getting paid. We can't pay our bills, and the domino effect rolls out across all the towns and across the province, or across the prairies, sorry. On top of the immediate financial problems, farmers are attempting to make decisions for the looming crop year. When cash flow has all but stopped for many farmers, the future looks bleak. I'd like to remind the committee, and Ian did it earlier, that in 2014, this not only affected grain, but it affected the fertilizer coming up from the Mississippi. It ultimately made it here, but it gave companies, input companies, reason to jack the prices, and farmers had to pay for that in the end. And truthfully, it shouldn't be this way. It doesn't need to be this way. I'm glad that CN acknowledged that they had made mistakes. This is a good start, but good intentions do not resolve the problem that grain farmers are facing. I recognize that we can't discount weather because it is an obvious safety issue. With that being said, rail has ran in Canada for over 100 years. Cold temperatures, snow in July shouldn't be a surprise, and we need better planning for that. CN and CP need to be better prepared and not get rid of power and have more frontline manpower. Their forecasting obviously was poor, so I suggest maybe they spend some money on that. Although Bill C-49 isn't a perfect bill, it does give shippers some clout and does put some of the onus back on the rail companies. We need to pass this bill with some of the proposed amendments sooner rather than later so that farmers have that much needed protection that they need. The government has stressed this year that agriculture will play a major role in strengthening our GDP and the middle class. We grain farmers are up to the task. We are amongst some of the most productive grain growers on the planet. Unfortunately, with the current grain transportation problems, we won't be able to easily meet these objectives. There's tens of thousands of farmers and hundreds of thousands of middle-class people who are negatively affected by backlogs like this. We need an efficient transportation system. We need to be able to move all commodities to market, grain, minerals, raw resources, finished goods. We need to be able to meet our customers' expectations. And we need good roads, rail lines that meet timelines and pipelines for oil. The Western Canadian wheat growers believe that this is a nonpartisan issue. Ships are waiting in Vancouver. Farmers have the grain that needs to be exported on these ships. Farmers and grain shippers want to work with you, the government, and we want to work with the rail companies. Let's collectively solve this problem. In closing, Mr. Chair, C-49 needs to be passed as soon as possible. We need long-term solutions to the problems that we are facing today. But first and foremost, we have to get this bill through, get it done before the summer comes along, so we can work with some of these clauses in there and make sure they do work. Mr. Chair, I thank the committee for meeting today. Let's make certain that we collectively are not just talking. We need to be doing, and starting today, we need to fix this problem for the long term. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fransoo. And now Mr. Mazier for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for having me here today to speak about this important issue in the grain transportation system. My name is Dan Mazier. I'm president of Keystone Agriculture Producers, which is Manitoba's general farm policy organization, representing over 7,000 farm families. I also am a farmer, grains and oilseeds farmers northeast of Brandon, Manitoba. In 2013-14, Canada suffered from a grain transportation crisis that is estimated to have cost Western Canadian farmers approximately $6.5 billion. When shippers, my grain buyers, are unable to readily move their commodities to port, they will begin offering farmers lower cash bids or no cash bids for their products. So, although farmers are not the actual shippers ordering the rail cars, they are the ones who end up bearing the cost for the port rail service. The Government of Canada responded in 2013-14 crisis in several ways, including an order in council that penalized the railways for missing grain movement targets and an accelerated schedule for the statutory review of the Canadian Transportation Act. Out of that review came several recommendations which were incorporated into Bill C-49 and which passed through the House of Commons and presently sits before the Senate, as you know. In 13-14, the magnitude of crisis caught many in government and industry off guard. This time around, we became aware of the challenges railways have been having moving our grain much earlier this year, largely because we now collect information on grain car orders and deliveries. This is done by a group called the Ag Transport Coalition, which reports weekly data on the number of grain cars are ordered by shippers compared to the number of cars each railway actually delivers. According to Ag Transport Coalition data for Manitoba, 6 weeks ago, at the beginning of February, CP supplied 74% of cars ordered. So far, so good. CN delivered 14%. Things only got worse from there. In CP's worst week in February, they only managed to deliver 17% of ordered cars. In CN's worst week, they delivered 0% of their orders. On average, the railways combined only delivered 29% of the cars were supplied on the want week for the month of February, which created a backlog of 28,000 cars, or approximately 35,000 trucks, leaving more than 30 ships waiting for grain off the coast of Port of Vancouver. So, how do we move forward and fix this problem before permanent damage to our country's reputation as a reliable shipper of grain is done again? A good first step is to come up with a plan to get the grain moving. As the committee knows, a co-signed letter went out to the railways from the Minister Garneau and Macaulay requesting such a plan and report back by March 15th. I also understand that CN has taken a proactive approach in communicating with shippers how they want to move forward. It all boils down to more people, more locomotives, and more products. I would encourage this committee using all the tools possible to monitor and support the ministers so we can all keep pressure on the railways to keep the backlog cleared. The elephant in the room is that we need to have Bill C-49 strengthened and passed as quickly as possible. As you know, it is presently before the Senate. I, along with other farm stakeholders, have given presentations with amendments that we argue will create a policy environment where the railways are held more accountable for their service failures and the impact they have on shippers. I would like to point out that the current design of the long-haul interswitching option in Bill C-49 is being viewed as overly restrictive in terms of which shippers are eligible to apply for it. We are recommending clarifying existing language for interswitching to ensure that it is most effective as possible for shippers to access this program. The most impactful amendment we are recommending is to empower the Canadian Transportation Agency to initiate investigations into service issues when it becomes aware to them and mandate solutions when necessary. Presently, the agency's ability to act under most provisions of the Canadian Transportation Act is triggered by an application or a complaint. For instance, although the agency is allowed to act on its own motion with respect to air carrier tariffs for international services, it can only examine and potentially correct issues with domestic tariff provisions in cases where an application has been received. Similarly, the agency power under Section 116 of the Canadian Transportation Act to order measures to address rail service level of service issues is conditional upon receipt of complaint. An extension of the agency's own motion authority would allow for proactive initiative inquiries where there is evidence that a problem might exist. This may include statistical evidence, a pattern of complaints, or consistent, credible media reports regarding a transportation service provider's financial difficulties or service failings. The authority would be particularly relevant to matters affecting more than one transportation service provider or user for which the existing complaint-based process is not particularly well suited. This measure was one of the recommendations made by David Emerson in 2016 to the report to Government of Canada, and that Ron Bonnet actually alluded to earlier this afternoon. We agree that these measures are necessary to help resolve service-related challenges that appear to be inherent to a monopoly marketplace like Canada's grain transportation system. In addition to these services-related measures, we are requesting that soybeans and related products be added to Schedule 2 list of the grains that are eligible to be covered under the maximum revenue entitlement. In Manitoba, with more than 2 million acres planted in 2017, soybeans represent our third largest crop by area. Currently, the transportation costs for soybeans are as much as 40% higher per car than the MRE covered grains, with no promise of getting these cars. So they're charging more, but we're still not getting those cars in the first place. There is no reason that farmers who have innovated, adapted to changing conditions should be denied the same protection from price exploitation by a monopoly industry that other crops receive. To conclude my remarks, I would like to make one point very clear. It is critical that Bill C-49 pass with these amendments before the House rises in June. This way, shippers and carriers will know what their obligations are under the law, and will make the needed investments to ensure that the 2018 crop is delivered to customers on time, and we do not suffer the same economic hardships as a country that we have now suffered twice in the less than half a decade. The railways must face repercussions if they fail to meet acceptable service standards. They must not be allowed to gouge captive shippers of soybeans, and their performance must continue to be carefully monitored and action taken when they fail. In Canada, our growing season is very short. Our seeding and harvest windows are narrow, and it is difficult to predict how long it will last. To deal with this challenge, we invest more in equipment than nearly any other farmer in the world. And when conditions are right, we work all day and all night to get the crop off the field and into the bin. I fully expect the railways to make investments necessary to get the job done. And if it requires senators and members of the parliament to work all day and night to get Bill C-49 strengthened and passed into law, then I expect that of you as well. Canada's economic well-being is critically tied to rail transportation. Do not shy away from your responsibility to ensure the Canada Transportation Act addresses the challenges we face and ensures that Canada's economy can grow to its full potential. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mazier, and we shall start our question round. Monsieur Berthold, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is our final hour in our study of this urgent situation we are faced with. We've heard a lot of witnesses. We've heard many of you today, and I have a direct question to put to the three of you, and I'd invite you to respond quickly. Would it be possible, yes or no, to save the present campaign, the present growing season? Do you think we have everything we need to save our crops for this year? Or, as Mr. Mazier just said, we're going to do everything to protect the next one, but is it too late for this year's crop year? I'd like to hear you on this.
Talking about something like an order in council, I think we're too late for that. Unfortunately, we've probably missed the boat. When this topic was really brought to light, say 3 weeks ago, there would have been the opportunity, but in that respect, we're definitely too late for that. And with road bans coming up, planting season coming up, we are going to deliver less grain. Right? It's just a matter of the fact. We got to get the crop in, and we can't run on roads that aren't made for trucks to run on. So an ordering council or something to that effect would be no benefit now, but it might have been, or it would have been a month ago.
You guys, I think Daryl's right. I don't think you can save this season. I don't think something like the ordering council would be necessarily the way to go. And there was talk about infrastructure spending earlier on today. If you want to spend money on infrastructure, you send us down those roads this spring. Force us to haul grain in 2 weeks. I would be applying for infrastructure grant for my farm because I would tear the heck out of the yard. So and the roads and the fields, it would be bad.
Yeah, we're 28,000 cars behind. That is to fix this. The minimum requirement. The plan was in October 5,000 cars a week. So, okay, we're going to be 500 cars a week over, 1,000 cars a week over. So that's 5,500 to 6,000 cars that they can do for the next how many weeks till next August. I don't know. Like the backlog, and it's going to be: is there enough room on our farms to accept the new crop? That's where we could have some real trouble. So as far as trying to save it, we've got time, but the railways really have to perform in top notch. And if past practice is any indication, I highly doubt it.
Ça me choque. Ça me choque.
I'm shocked at this news. I'm very angry. I'm very upset. Truly.
Them to act. We told them a lot time. And this season is failing because of the lack of action of the Liberals. I don't want you to be politics. I can't. I'll do. Okay? We told them in June last year to split the bill, to pass some amendments you just requires. The Liberals defeated all the amendments we proposed. And now you're asking them again to make this amendment to C-49. I hope that this time they will accept it if we want to fix the problem for a long term. But I think you should work a lot with the Liberals and try to convince them to accept those amendments because you will have another bad season next year. C'est insultant ce qui est en train d'arriver.
What is happening is insulting. We asked for an emergency meeting 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. And you're saying that 3 weeks ago we might have been able to change the course of things. Perhaps you could have avoided some of these issues. Unfortunately, people are saying, oh, too bad, it's not urgent, we'll do that on the 19th. Mr. Chairman, I believe it is important to deliver a message, a clear message. We must stop playing games with the grain producers of Western Canada. We have to work to ensure that their grain is hauled to market. It's the responsibility of the government. It's our responsibility as a committee to demand that the government ensure that grain is moved, is delivered so that producers can be paid. It's the reputation of Canada and the reputation of grain producers that is at play here. How do you feel, Mr. Sekulik, when you're a young farmer, you have debts to pay back? How do you feel when you realize that you can't sell your product? How do you react in your family at home? How do you feel?
It's really stressful, and especially in fact in the light that I learned my lessons really hard in 2013-14. I planned my sales. I generally sell everything October, or a vast majority of my crop to sell in October, November, December, with the anticipation that I can move it by March. And I have to plan for that every year, and I shouldn't really I shouldn't be planning for railway risk. I don't think I should be anyway, but I do, and it can be quite stressful. I've got a bag of canola that is supposed to move in March. I was told my elevator that it probably won't move till the middle of April. And I won't be moving much in the middle of April. I'm far north, so the thaw generally comes a little later than other parts of Alberta.
Yeah, Mr. Fransoo?
Yeah, I echo those statements. You know, I call it nonpartisan, but there's always some politics at play. And maybe the boat was missed on a couple things early on. It shouldn't have been an omnibus bill. We know that. But let's learn from those mistakes right now, and it's a win-win-win for everyone. It's a win for this side of the table, this side of the table, and this side of the table to get this bill passed as soon as we can. So.
And hope that the amendment will pass too.
Right. It definitely does strengthen the bill tremendously, actually. If the amendments were to hold up the bill for some amount of time or an indefinite amount of time, I could go without them, but it shouldn't be that big of an issue to pass those few amendments that we're asking for and the bill and have it done by the time you guys rise for the summer.
Thank you, Mr. Fransoo. Now, Mr. Longfield for 6 minutes. Merci, Monsieur Berthold.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for coming the distance you have at the time of year you've done this. It really shows the commitment to your community, and we really appreciate you staying for this meeting. I don't want to get into the partisan discussion about Conservatives in the other place or us in the House of Commons. I mean, we are trying to solve a problem for you. We do need to see some action going forward, and I think we're talking about that today. What I'm very interested in is how you discuss these things as a group, how you interact with your neighbors, your farmers down the road. I'm thinking of what used to go on in the Petro-Can in Clonsey, Saskatchewan at lunchtime. They would talk about what was going on in the fields, who was late getting stuff in, whose wife was kicking their butt because they weren't out on the field today. The conversations around the dinner table at noon in Clonsey. How do you have those conversations between farmers, and what's the opportunity to involve the larger supply chain, the shippers, the storage people? How do you collaborate?
We're in constant contact with our elevator agents, and we're in constant contact with each other. I've got a whole bunch of friends on Messenger that we talk multiple times a day. We talk through the commissions, through press releases, through the commissions, and through surveys, and so we talk a heck of a lot about this. This is how we get paid, so it's a significant issue that gets talked about a lot.
Likely missing people at the table. Like, if we were to look at this as a supply chain, if your productivity is increasing, you're putting a lot more through your farm than you used to put through. The system isn't handling it. Throw in a couple of weather events or other things that go on that stop things from moving. Cars that don't get to the site on time. How do we have that full discussion to make sure that we get the issues identified before they're blowing up in our faces?
I guess it's quite interesting. We've never had, up until 2014, late 2014, we established the Ag Transport Coalition. That was the first time we had a window into what the shippers were actually requesting, demand. We were told at that time, and it went on for a couple of years, that they make up a plan. They make up a plan that starts June, July, just like we were going to sow our crops. They know how many acres are sown out there. Well, they had that same plan this fall. It was supposed to be 5,000 cars. And the problem is when it stops, when it starts messing up, and it was CNI. I remember the meeting very, very clearly this October. They came up and said, well, we got good news and bad news. CN said, well, we've seen, we were projecting 2% growth in the economy, and we got 13%. And sorry, we got to do some catching up to there. Like, I just can't get over the missed opportunities we've had, and this is the second time.
Yep.
In 5 years, like.
Because the reality is we can't shift all resources to grain because other sectors need cars as well.
But they cut back way too much on their capital, like on their staffing and on their power.
Sure, and I'm not saying that we need to serve the grain industry. But the capital forecast, how we get that conversation is, I think, to avoid future problems. If we continue to have bumper crops, and we've exceeded 2013, 2014 in last year's crop, we're looking at the same numbers even more this coming year. You guys are young farmers. You're starting, or you're into the start of a generation of farmers that are going to face these issues. We need to have a better way of governing so that amongst yourselves, us, the shippers, to make sure we all know what's going on, because it shouldn't be at the end of the season that we figure out that we've got a problem.
I think they definitely missed the ball on forecasting this time, but there's no incentive for them to spend money on capacity like that when we can't hit their bottom line, and that's what some of Bill 49 will do. Is we can hit them where it hurts, and maybe they will spend more money on forecasting, or maybe they won't be so long on resources because they know there is some loss to be had. I definitely agree that we have to move all commodities. They all are a commodity. Economy depends on all of them, and like I said, that includes getting pipelines built. I think that'll take some capacity off the rail line that can be used for grain. So
I think my question earlier with one of the witnesses from the rails was the penalties aren't going to increase our throughput. We have to increase our throughput before we get to that stage.
Giving the CTA more power to investigate before, that I think that's a key. That's probably the biggest amendment if we could make a fundamental change of how we look at this.
Is the structure of the CTA.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm thinking that as well from our conversations.
And then allowing the interswitching to have other companies pick up the slack if the one company isn't performing. The competitiveness of the interswitch amendment is a huge. We think it's a big deal. It could really help this legislation work the way it's intended.
Good. In 30 seconds, was there something on your pages that you didn't get out that you'd like to get out?
No, it was covered in lots of the other talks. It was just going through the reciprocal penalties and the interswitching. So,
thank you, and really thank you for standing up for your communities and for coming all the way across the country to try and help us to solve the problem with you.
Thank you, Mr. Longfield. Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mazur, in your exchange with Mr. Longfield, you were talking about both railways' performance indicators and the power of the locomotives they had and their workforce. And I had asked them when they were here earlier about the net trend from 2013, 2014 up to now, about how many locomotives they'd had in their workforce to see if there had been kind of a dip, and are they trying to catch up all of a sudden? What has been your experience with that trend with those companies over the past few years?
So in 13, 14, excuse me, they cut back too much. CP was, there was a fellow named Hunter Harrison that was around at the time. And they started the whole process of making sure that their capital was utilized the most. And that started a whole, it changed the way railways use their capital and their investment, but it also at the cost of service. The shareholders were very happy about that response, but it did not serve Canada very well. And you can't look at Canada the same way you look at the United States. When you got two independent railways, they have obligations and they have lots of rights in Canada, but what comes with that is lots of responsibility. And they have a responsibility to service Canadians, and especially people that only have access to one shipper. And I don't know, they've somehow that they've focused away from that. Even in the data that they were presenting today, it was nothing about here's what we're seeing for demand. They know what we're demanding. We need 5,000 cars a week. They know the plan. They didn't mention how many cars. They just said here's what we delivered. There was no language understanding like agriculture language in that at all for delivering cars. Bless you. So I think we've got a long ways to go. They did cut, from what I remember, back 2 years ago, 2,000 employees, and several locomotives. CN did, and they did very well last year. They supplied the thing, but what we had to ship, but there wasn't much economic activity. CP, on the other hand, last year we missed it. As a farm group, I was irate when I turned around in April and started talking to farmers, and there was a lot. Southwestern Manitoba, southeastern Saskatchewan was particularly hard hit. They were around 40-50% all winter, CP last year, and no one said anything. So this is they got away with it last year, and I kind of feel bad for CN this year. But I mean, it's got to stop. They don't understand.
Can I just get a quick comment from you? You know, you were mentioning the 28,000 car backlog, and you're pretty pessimistic on recovering or part of this year's crop. Are the programs to deal with crises like the advanced payments program, the suite of business risk management tools, are they adequate, or is there something we can do to improve them? Any suggestions for for this crisis here?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, if we don't get rid of the backlog, so what's going to happen in August, September, we're going to either have to build more bins and we're going to have more debt, but we're not going to be able to pay bills. So either they can defer the interest from that, from those actual payments, and I think they can do that. I think that was done the last time in 13-14. They can actually say, well, if you can't pay there's a deadline for last year's crop of September 31st, so they could actually defer interest on that and say, no, we're going to let it go to January or whenever till we can get rid of the crop. So until we get those numbers down and see what kind of summer they have, they could apply for that. And increasing the limits would help. But as we all testified, it's borrowing money for when you got money in the bin. It comes out. There's the other thing we haven't talked about. As our grain comes into summertime or into spring, the temperature of the grain's changing. So we have to recondition it now. We have to turn the fans back on. We got to make sure there was snow that sifted in. There's condensations going on. So we got to rehandle that grain again, maybe pull some bins out, just circulate them. Meanwhile, put a crop in, start sowing it, seeding it, spraying it, all that kind of stuff. So it adds that much more complexity.
Is it Mr. Sekulich?
Yeah.
And Mr. Fransoo, if I can get both of you to comment. You both experienced 2013, 2014, and you look at what we're going through now. Just any general comments you have on the parallels between the two, and are we going to repeat this sad story in another 4 years, or are you optimistic that we have got something before us that will actually tackle this problem?
Well, I think if we can pass this bill with the amendments that we're pretty much as a supply chain recommending, right from I think that we can go a long ways to fixing the problem. I sure don't want to be coming back here in 4 years. I was here in 2013, 14. I learned those lessons really well and really hard, so I managed that risk right from the get-go every year now. Myself on my own business plans and my own marketing plans and that type of thing. So I'm behind, but I did manage that risk. I didn't ever want to get stuck in the situation where I was looking at February, because the FCC moved the things back to March in 2013-14. It used to be February 15th was the payback. Now it's March 15th, and they're talking about pushing it back again. I don't want to be looking at coming through into the middle of January, end of January, and I haven't moved my contracts, and I sure as heck don't have my cash in the bank to pay that FCC bill. So,
I echo a lot of that. We just got to concentrate on getting this bill passed as quick as we can. And amendments where everyone's asking for them. They're just no-brainers. Let's get them in there and get this done.
Thank you, Mr. Fransoo. I have to move on. So thank you, Mr. McGregor. Monsieur Drouin for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks so much for staying late with us. Quick, Warren, thanks all. We're on first name basis. Francis, Warren, nice to see you. Great. Listen, you mentioned that you've had to create a buffer zone in order to, because of the unpredictability of the rail system. And can you talk to me? How do you have that conversation with your accountant, I guess, on how to create that buffer zone for you? And has that changed? How much has that increased since the incident in 2013-14?
Well, it's not really a conversation with my accountant. It's just I took 13-14 and saw how long the contracts got pushed back. And I know from past experiences that our service in the Peace Country it can be pretty terrible. We can be the last to get cleaned out. I just don't leave the risk on the table that I won't have my grain delivered in time to pay my bills. I try not to anyway. So I sell a big proportion of my grain early. So that's how I manage that risk. And I end up paying a bit of a penalty if you're selling, like, say, September, October for wider bases, because that's when everyone wants to sell. But it's just a better risk to take, in my opinion, than not having the cash flow to pay my bills later on. Mm-hmm. If that answered.
Okay, and I do want to focus on the long term, and I'm not yet convinced, as a member of parliament, I'm not yet convinced that, I know C49 will answer a lot of the questions, but in terms of capacity, and I've spoken to a lot of your members and a lot of farmers, and they're saying, yeah, we're getting a lot more efficient on the farm, we can produce a lot more on the same acreage of land. So that means obviously production is going to increase, but I'm wondering, Mr. Mazur, are you having that conversation with the rail companies in terms of the long term? What's the 5-year, 10-year output? And are we ramping up capacity?
Good question.
Because we will be back here in 4 years, even if C49 is there, but we don't have that capacity, and we don't ramp up capacity, it will happen again.
We did have the solutions back in 13, 14.
Yeah.
We talked about giving the agency more power. Being more proactive, I think is the word we're all looking for, is instead of reactive. The railway companies are, as long as they're focusing on stockholders' share, we're all going to lose. We're going to lose as Canadians. And they got to get their head around that they're supposed to be offering us a service. And when the economy starts ramping up, their solution is to ration, to cancel orders, to actually stomp out that economy, to restrict it. I mean, I don't know how a carrier in good conscience could actually do that, especially in Canada with having the monopolistic power that they actually have. It doesn't make any sense at all. They need regulations.
I completely agree, but I'm concerned about, do we have the infrastructure in place to answer in the demand in 5 years? And that takes a while to build, right?
And I think that they are coming to everybody and saying, this is the infrastructure we're putting in. They know they have some choke points. I know in Vancouver, they talk about the bridge going over the water and the other one up to Prince Rupert. Like, they know they got some pretty vulnerable spots. But I think they're ready to invest and to work with us. But it does come down to a lot of their problems could be solved by using their power and their staff a lot more efficient. Don't be cutting down right to the bone. When the economy slides down a little bit, be ready for that little bump instead of that 2% bump, say an 8% bump. Like, put that in your model and then see what that looks like.
And that's one of the questions that I've asked previous witnesses, was the fact that I think there's an opportunity for you guys to talk about projections with the rail companies, but there's not an opportunity for feedback after the fact. And would that be something that you guys would welcome, in terms of saying, okay, well, look, even when we have great years and when they've met, I would suspect that over 80% would be great news in today's cases. But if there's an opportunity for you guys to provide feedback and say, yeah, okay, this year we've met our numbers, but here's how we can improve the service for next year.
They have to start talking to our shippers, to our grain buyers. They have to understand what they go through, because we've all locked in next year's price. We've got probably 20% of our product locked in for next fall already. Railways don't get that. Like, we are different in agriculture. You can shut down a mine, you can shut down an oil line, you can stop these industries, you can shut down a car plant, but you can't shut down agriculture. Like, we go on cycles, we have the sun shines, rains, we produce. And that's what we're hardwired to do, and we're going to keep on doing that because the government is sending us very clear signals to produce more. So they really got to get, we can, as producers, farmers, we can scream all we want, but they have to start understanding what our grain companies are going through and our buyers. Why would they take on all this risk if they're not even going to provide them a service to move the grain? I don't know if you guys want to comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Drouin. Monsieur Poisson pour 6 minutes.
6 minutes, monsieur. 6 minutes, Mr. Poisson. Thank you so much for being here. Earlier, you said there'd be about, you'd have a backlog, a delay of some 20,000 cars. And instead of having 4,000 cars a week, there would be 3,200 a week only. Is that figured into your calculation, into the 20,000 that you were talking about?
On week 1, 2, or whatever, They didn't show up either to the next week. So then they've got more orders. They've got to clean up week 1 and week 2 and say they only delivered half of them. So then they get bumped and they say, oh, no, we only brought half of them again. So that's 28,000 cars of missed opportunity. And meanwhile, we have, as was alluded to earlier this afternoon, there's another crop coming from another part of the world that we didn't even think we were going to be competing against because our grain was supposed to be gone. The plan was 5,000 cars a week. The shippers were there, the railways agreed to it, but the railways decided they had another plan, and winter came, I guess.
Further to that, if the plan was 5,000 cars a week, the elevators buy grain to their expected level of service. And so they're only buying grain from me or from the farmers up to what they can expect to ship. And so they're doing that, as far as I understand, based on their agreements with the rail companies, and the rail companies aren't living up to those agreements. So it's frustrating on the farm level where they, like the rail or the line companies or the shippers are actually, they're just buying up to what the railways say they can to the demand the railways say, or the cars that the railways say they can supply. So they're not even living up to that.
Et on sait.
We know that C49 should settle issues to a certain extent, even to a large extent. But with C49 and the amendments, will you still need more? Is this totally answering all your needs?
I don't think it's quite strong enough, but that doesn't mean we can't get it passed and get some clout for the shippers, right? We maybe next time around we have to circle the wagons and look into the MRE or whatnot. But what is important today is to get this bill passed.
There is no silver bullet. It will go a long ways in fixing a lot of things, and in modern day things. We've dismantled the wheat board that, you know, in some way they did control the flow of grain. They bought it differently, as Minister Ritz alluded to this earlier today. So things flowed differently in Canada. We have a new market called Japan all of a sudden coming into the West Coast. Like, things have changed in Manitoba or in Canada. And I think a modern day C49 bill will bring us up to date, at least to address these problems. The problem is, part of the act is it needs updating. We've transformed as a country, and we just haven't been able to adapt regulatory wise to make it happen for everybody.
Okay, en terminant.
Just by way of conclusion, earlier I asked the people around the table the following question. Would there be a possibility of having elevators nearer the ports so that the crop could be brought in closer to the ports, and when the time comes to actually ship, it would be easier? Do you think this is an idea that would be feasible?
Farmers are already hauling insane or huge distances. Some farmers are hauling 4 hours one way to get to the high throughputs already. So if you start taking the term or maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but if you start building the elevator, okay.
Oui, dans le fond, c'est lorsqu'on part en période.
Yes, but the ports, the cars would be able to start moving grain right away just to fill the elevators that would be located nearest the ports. In difficult times, though, there would be reserves to meet demand because they would have already been shipped there to the elevators near the ports.
Treat Alberta, they're closer. So they'll do cycle times quickly, then they'll go and empty out Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We actually go lots to the St. Lawrence Seaway. 60% of our product goes from Manitoba that way. So it's kind of interesting. Like, the railways kind of got it figured out, but if stuff goes real bad, They empty out Alberta first, and then they'll go in probably southern Alberta, not northern Alberta, and then they'll start whittling away at the western. So they're using the closer elevators, but there's still a mountain range in there that they have to get through.
Merci, Monsieur Poisson. Mr. Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Poisson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll maybe split some of my time with Mr. Dreeshen as well. It's frustrating that we're dealing with this, and it's sad to see or hear from our producers today who have pretty much resigned themselves to the fact that this is a lost season. Especially frustrating when, as Mr. Fransoo said, action could have been taken weeks, if not months ago, to address this season, regardless of what happens with C-49. Especially, and this is no fault of my colleagues across the way, because we do work fairly well together. But many of the amendments that are being discussed right now that you have all talked about today were brought up in the Transport Committee by the Conservatives, and the Liberals voted them down in the Transport Committee. So a lot of these things that we're talking about, and we're already talking about dealing with things next year, the consequences of this year, when this should never have happened if we had acted quickly on the advice from stakeholders and the advice of members who have been through this before in 13 and 14. So, I'm just shaking my head that we're having to deal with this, and we're already talking about how to deal with the consequences. And Mr. Frazier, you talked about CN getting through this somehow before, despite massive cuts. Well, that's because nothing was being transported in the energy sector, is how they managed to get through that. But a little bit different this time around. And you're right, they made massive cuts to staff and equipment, and now they're trying to scramble to get it back. But my question would be, Ian Boxall brought it up before, and he talked about, he pays $360,000 a year in freight alone. The numbers from 2013, 2014 were the cost of the industry was $8 billion because of that last crisis. Any idea on what this is costing you this time around? And have you recovered from 13 and 14 financially?
I think it's a little too early to put a dollar amount on it. Fortunately, this time around, we are a little later in the season. In 13-14, we really seen that basis widen, where right now we're just starting to see it widen. So it's a little too early to put a number on it. But the fact that we're taking out, a lot of farmers are taking out more debt to pay off their debt, shows that we have a big problem here.
And we also heard, over the last few weeks that our transport minister and agriculture minister consistently stand up and defend the railway, saying, we've talked to CN, we've talked to CP. They really relied on them to try and solve this problem, and we've seen the consequences of that. In your opinion, and from the answers you heard today from CN and CP, do you have any faith that without the consequences of fines, penalties, mandatory volume regulations, would there be any incentive for CN and CP to improve their service?
No, that's a straight answer. No, their plans were nothing. A lot of CN stuff was already stuff that was announced, to be quite frank. And then CP kind of just I felt they brushed farmers by the wayside with their letter to the minister, unfortunately.
They didn't talk about grain at all. They didn't in their replies. So it was basically business as usual. This is how we're reacting to it, but it was not agriculture or grain specific, which is I think they missed the mark on it. But to answer your question, if we did get C-49, when we get it passed, not if, when we get it passed, it will enable a lot of us to do a lot more things to the railways to hold them accountable. So that's why we need it passed.
Yeah, and you touched on it right, but sometimes the government has to step in and take some action, some definitive action that could have addressed this weeks ago, and they didn't. I'd like to share the rest of my time with Mr. Dreeshen.
Well, thank you, John. And again, as we've heard so many times, C-49 passed with the amendments is kind of the critical aspect of it. Otherwise, we're again going to be coming back dealing with this later on. One of the things that we talked about earlier is the APP and should it be raised from 400 to 800,000 and so on. I mean, all of those things don't help unless you know exactly when it is that you want to use that tool. Because if all you're doing is punting it down the road, you've lost all of the contract opportunities and in your marketing. So I mean that can work. You can use it, but you better know that the year before rather than trying to deal with it on an ad hoc basis. And of course, the other aspect of it is the trade. What we really are missing throughout. And I was just in Southeast Asia a couple of weeks ago talking on trade issues, and again, so we tried to say, well, we'll be able to market these products and look at the great things that you would get if you had our Canadian grain or our beef and so on. But they look at it and they say, well, right now we know that we can get it from Australia. There's no issues right there, and so I know that we're losing all of these opportunities because of the way people look at it. So I think really that's kind of one of the aspects of it that we have to recognize, a forecasting of railways, a 2-3% increase, and we'll just do it as the economy. But as farmers, we are increasing the volumes immensely. And it's because we have the skills and the tools and are going from there. So I guess the key concern that I have is how do we make sure that we keep this pressure on all during the summer so that they are ready on August 1st when week 1 shows up to handle the issues that we always have been facing.
So, unfortunately, that's all the time.
Well, I got my story again, so that's that.
So I guess that covers our meeting. I want to certainly thank all of you for taking the time to that extra long day also, and wish you a good trip back, and thanks. I think the message has been heard. Sorry.
I want to thank all the members of the committee too, Mr. Chair, because they accepted to have this urgent and emergency meeting. I think that we appreciate the fact that we have these 4-hour meetings. I wanted just to put it on the record.